There is a moment in the history of popular music when two worlds collided. Not on a stage, not in a recording studio, but in the open air of public opinion, where words land harder than guitars and silences speak louder than applause. One man had built an empire on elegance. The other was still building something the world had no name for yet. One wore a perfectly pressed suit and commanded rooms with a whisper. The other wore whatever he wanted, moved however he pleased, and made rooms feel like they might catch fire. Their names were Frank Sinatra and Mick Jagger, and the story of what passed between them is not simply a story about two musicians who disagreed. It is a story about two entirely different ideas of what music is supposed to do to a human being. And what happens when those ideas meet head-on? To understand the collision, you have to understand both men separately first. You have to feel the weight each of them carried before they ever became aware of each other. Because this is not a story about villains. This is a story about two giants standing in the same space and realizing that the space was not built to contain both of their visions of the world. Frank Sinatra was born in Hoboken, New Jersey in 1915, the son of Italian immigrants who scraped and clawed their way into American life. He grew up understanding, at a cellular level, what it meant to want something so badly that the wanting itself reshapes you. He taught himself to breathe through a phrase the way a swimmer learns to breathe through water, completely, naturally, as if it required no effort at all, which of course meant it required everything. By the time the 1940s arrived, Sinatra was not merely famous. He was a phenomenon that America had no precedent for. Teenage girls fainted at his concerts. The press called it Sinatramania and scrambled to explain it, mostly failing. He was cool in the way that a perfectly balanced knife is cool, precise, purposeful, and capable of cutting through anything in its path. By the 1950s, Sinatra had survived a career collapse that would have ended most artists and rebuilt himself into something even more. He won an Academy Award for acting. He recorded albums that remain to this day among the most carefully constructed bodies of work in the history of popular American music. He understood the mechanics of a song the way a watchmaker understands the mechanics of time. Every gear, every spring, every tiny movement contributing to an outcome that seemed, from the outside, effortless and inevitable. He was the chairman of the board. He was not given that title. He earned it, negotiated it from life itself, and then wore it like a second skin. Frank Sinatra believed in craft. He believed in restraint. He believed that the space between notes was as important as the notes themselves, and that a performer's job was to serve the song, not to overwhelm it. He believed that the relationship between a singer and an audience was built on intimacy, on the shared understanding that both parties were participating in something refined, something that asked something of everyone present. He believed, fundamentally, that music was about control, about the mastery of emotion rather than its raw unleashing. And then along came the 1960s, and along came rock and roll, and along eventually came Mick Jagger. Michael Philip Jagger was born in Dartford, England in 1943, into a world still rebuilding itself from the rubble of the Second World War. His father was a physical education teacher. His mother was a hairdresser. They were respectable, ordinary, and utterly unprepared for what their eldest son would become. Dartford was not the kind of place where legends were supposed to originate. It was a commuter town, a transit point, a place people passed through on their way to somewhere more significant. But Mick Jagger was paying attention to things that most people around him could not even hear yet. He was listening to American records, blues records, records by Muddy Waters and Chuck Berry and Little Richard and Howlin' Wolf. Music that had crossed the Atlantic, carrying something the English music establishment had no framework to process. It was raw. It was physical. It moved in ways that polite society had not sanctioned. And the young Jagger heard in it something that felt more true to his interior life than anything in the careful, ordered world of post-war British respectability. He met Keith Richards on a train platform in Dartford in 1961, and the connection between them was immediate. They both loved the blues, they both carried records under their arms, and they both felt, without quite being able to articulate it yet, that something was about to happen in music that would change everything. They began rehearsing with other musicians in cramped London flats and basement clubs, working through songs their parents would not have recognized. They called themselves the Rolling Stones, a reference to the Muddy Waters song, a rejection of stillness, a promise of perpetual motion. By 1963, the Rolling Stones were generating a particular kind of attention in London, not the warm, appreciative attention that comes from a polished performance delivered well. Something more unsettled. Something that made venue owners nervous and audiences feel like the floor might tilt beneath them at any moment. Jagger understood, intuitively and then consciously, that what he was doing on stage was not simply singing, it was confrontation. An argument made entirely through movement and sound, an argument that said ordinary life is too small, the rules are too tight, and the body knows things the mind has been trained to suppress. The Rolling Stones came to America for the first time in 1964, and America was not entirely sure what to make of them. They were not as immediately accessible as the Beatles, who had arrived that same year with melodies that felt like invitations. The Stones felt more like a challenge. Jagger's stage presence was something that American television cameras struggled to frame. He did not stand still, he prowled. He spun. He leaned into the microphone as if he were having an argument with it, then pulled back as if he had won. He was doing something that had no name yet, and the audience felt it before they understood it. It was during this period, as rock and roll was consolidating its grip on an entire generation's imagination, that Frank Sinatra first began to speak publicly about what he thought of the new music. And he was not subtle about it. Sinatra had watched the rise of rock and roll with something between disdain and genuine alarm. He was not alone. Many established figures of American popular music felt that rock and roll represented not merely a shift in taste but a cultural regression, a retreat from sophistication into something primitive and formless. But Sinatra was the most prominent voice to say so, and he said it with the particular confidence of a man who had earned the right to have opinions. His criticisms were pointed and public. He described rock and roll as the province of the immature and the unserious. He suggested its practitioners were not artists in any meaningful sense, but performers of organized noise that happened to appeal to people who had not yet developed the capacity to appreciate. He did not name Jagger specifically in every instance, but as the 1960s progressed and the Rolling Stones became impossible to ignore, the references became easier to read. In 1957, Sinatra had written an article in which he described rock and roll in terms that would be quoted for decades, calling it the most brutal, ugly, desperate, vicious form of expression it had been his misfortune to hear. Music sung, played, and written for the most part by cretinous goons, and by means of its almost imbecilic reiteration managed to become the martial music of every side, burned delinquent on the face of the earth. Those words did not lose their relevance as the Rolling Stones rose. If anything, they became a kind of standing challenge that the Stones seemed to answer with every record they released and every stage they occupied. What Sinatra perhaps did not fully account for was the degree to which his dismissal was itself a form of attention. Every time a respected establishment figure declared that rock and roll was dangerous or degrading, an entire generation heard something different. They heard confirmation. They heard proof that what they were listening to was real, that it touched something the older generation wanted to keep untouched. Sinatra's contempt was, paradoxically, one of rock and roll's greatest assets, not because it was designed that way, but because young people of the 1960s had learned to read establishment reactions as a compass pointing toward authenticity, and Jagger read it that way too. He was not threatened by Sinatra's dismissal. he was energized by it, because Sinatra's contempt confirmed that what the Rolling Stones were doing mattered enough to provoke a reaction from the most powerful figure in the world they were challenging. You do not inspire that kind of hostility by being irrelevant. You inspire it by touching something real, something the other person needs to protect, because they sense how thoroughly you are dismantling it. But fairness must be applied here. The version of events that frames Sinatra simply as the establishment villain and Jagger simply as the revolutionary hero misses something important. Sinatra was not defending privilege for its own sake. He was defending a tradition that had cost him everything to master. When he criticized rock and roll, he was in part expressing the grief of watching something he loved. The crafted song, the controlled performance, the intimate relationship between singer and listener, being displaced by something that seemed to value none of those things. And Jagger, for his part, was not simply rejecting Sinatra's world. He was transforming it. The Rolling Stones were not careless musicians. The recordings they made in the 1960s and 1970s were the products of serious artistic labor, of musicians who had studied their craft, even as they appeared to be throwing the rulebook away. Keith Richards's guitar work was rooted in the blues tradition that Sinatra himself respected. Charlie Watts played with a jazz drummer's economy and precision. The music was more disciplined than it appeared, and that discipline was part of what made it last. The 1960s moved forward, and the Rolling Stones became larger. Not simply popular, that word is too small. They became a cultural force that generated its own gravity. Songs arrived that felt less like entertainment and more like weather. Things that changed the atmosphere of wherever they played. Satisfaction arrived in 1965 and immediately became more than a song. It became a statement, a declaration that an entire generation recognized as its own. Paint It Black demonstrated that the Stones could go somewhere darker and stranger than their contemporaries were willing to follow. Sympathy for the Devil arrived in 1968 and introduced a character into the popular imagination that made comfortable people deeply uncomfortable, which was entirely the point. The contrast between these two men played out most visibly not in any direct confrontation. They never shared a stage, never debated each other publicly in any sustained way, but in the cultural spaces they each occupied. In the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s, the Rolling Stones were selling out the largest venues in the world. Their concerts were not simply performances, they were events, occasions, experiences that people traveled across countries to attend. Audiences of 50,000, 70,000, 100,000 people filled fields and stadiums. Sinatra's world was the theater, the casino showroom, the concert hall. Intimate by comparison, governed by different rules, built on different expectations. His audiences were there to be moved by craft, by the perfection of a phrase, by watching a master do precisely what a master does. This was not a lesser experience, but the world was increasingly organized around the kind of experience that Jagger was providing. In 1972, the Rolling Stones embarked on what became known as the Exile on Main Street Tour of North America. One of the most celebrated rock tours in history, it was a demonstration of scale and cultural force that had no real precedent. Hundreds of people traveling together, entire stadiums transformed for a single night, a production apparatus that rivaled a military operation in its complexity. And at the center of it all was Jagger, running, spinning, commanding, refusing to let even one moment go slack, delivering the same physical and emotional commitment in the 75th minute that he had delivered in the first. Sinatra was watching. He always watched, and whatever he said publicly, the evidence of what he privately understood began to surface in small ways. He began, in the early 1970s, to acknowledge that certain rock musicians were doing something that deserved respect, even if he did not personally enjoy it. He never fully recanted his earlier statements, but the categorical dismissal softened slightly, and in that softening was something like recognition. one professional acknowledging, however reluctantly, that another professional was doing something that worked. Both men were aware of each other in the way that only genuine peers can be, with an attentiveness that goes beyond casual observation. Jagger had grown up hearing Sinatra. He had understood what that music was doing, had absorbed its lessons about performance and presence, even as he was building something that looked entirely different from the outside. And Sinatra, watching Jagger perform, was seeing something he recognized, not in the style or the music, but in the fundamental commitment to the moment, the refusal to give an audience anything less than everything, the understanding that performance is a contract that demands total fulfillment. The 1980s brought turbulence. The Rolling Stones could not simply continue. They had to justify continuation, prove with each decade that they were still capable of producing something that mattered. The 1980s were not the Stones' strongest decade creatively, and Jagger himself went through a period of real uncertainty. A solo career that received mixed responses, a period of genuine tension with Keith Richards that threatened to end the band entirely. But he came back. He always came back. In 1989, the Rolling Stones returned with the Steel Wheels Tour, one of the largest rock tours ever mounted at that point in history. The numbers were extraordinary, audiences collectively numbering in the millions, a demonstration that after nearly 3 decades, the Rolling Stones were not finished. They were, in some ways, larger than they had ever been. Sinatra passed away in May of 1998. He was 82 years old, carrying the particular weight of a man who knows what he used to be capable of and must now watch that capability recede. The tributes that followed were enormous because the world understood, perhaps more fully in his absence than it had while he was present, what he had represented and what he had given. Jagger spoke about him with genuine respect, with the careful acknowledgement of a man paying tribute to a predecessor who had shaped the culture that had shaped him, even in opposition. The relationship between them had never been warm, had never resolved into simple friendship or mutual admiration. But in the end, it had been something more interesting than either of those things. A genuine artistic argument, carried out across decades between two people who disagreed fundamentally about what music was for and proved, each in their own way, that both of them were right. Because here is what the long view reveals. Sinatra was right that craft matters. He was right that discipline produces lasting art, that there is something in a perfectly constructed song, perfectly performed, that cannot be replicated by raw energy alone. The recordings he made in the 1950s and early 1960s remain extraordinary precisely because of the qualities he championed: the control, the precision, the deep understanding of how a song works and what it needs from a singer. And Jagger was right that music needs to live in the body, that performance is itself a form of communication, that the willingness to take physical and emotional risks in front of an audience produces something that careful control alone cannot achieve. The recordings the Rolling Stones made in the 1960s and 70s remain extraordinary for the opposite reasons: the rawness, the risk, the sense of something that could have gone wrong and did not, or did, and that too became part of the music. Mick Jagger is still performing. He walks out onto stages at an age that should, by any reasonable physical accounting, make this impossible. And he runs and spins and reaches for the microphone, and the crowd responds the way crowds have always responded to him, with something beyond ordinary enthusiasm, something that resembles recognition, as if they are not merely watching a performance, but witnessing proof of something they needed to have proven. The boy from Dartford who carried blues records through rainy English streets became a physical argument for the idea that music lives in the body, that performance is philosophy, that the stage is a place where human beings can discover things about themselves that they cannot find anywhere else. He became, against all probability, permanent, not in the way that monuments are permanent, cold and fixed and visited out of obligation, but in the way that fire is permanent, always different, always consuming, always new. The argument between Frank Sinatra and Mick Jagger was never going to produce a winner because it was never really an argument between two people. It was an argument between two ideas about what human beings need from music. Whether they need it to be beautiful and controlled and refined, or raw and physical and dangerous. And the answer, which took decades to emerge fully, is that they need both. They have always needed both. That is what this story is. Not the story of a winner and a loser. Not the story of the past being defeated by the future, or the future being validated against the past. It is the story of two extraordinarily committed human beings who each found a way to make sound mean something, who each gave everything they had to their particular vision of what music could do, and who together, in their disagreement and their distance, produced something that neither of them could have produced alone. A conversation, a long, loud, complicated, never quite finished conversation about what it means to perform, what it means to endure, and what it means to give a crowd of human beings something worth remembering long after the music stops.